Hello, and welcome to the Final Girls podcast, where we explore the intersections of horror film and feminism. This is Anna, co founder of the Final Girls, and your podcast host. This episode, we are taking a little detour from our current season dedicated to exploring the monsters feminine to talk about a haunting fairy tale esque film that has just dropped online. A sort of grand guignol Groundhog Day, Koko-Di Koko-Da follows a couple on a camping trip after a tragedy befalls their young daughter. With the shadow of their shared trauma still hanging over them, the pair finds themselves in an endless loop of torment, humiliation, and tangled dreams at the hand of a troupe of outlandishly distorted nursery rhyme antagonists. If that synopsis doesn't do it for you, I can confirm that it is creepy as hell, and a horror film doesn't quite fit into the genre, but is so interesting. And it stayed with me for a while after I first saw it last year. I'm joined by podcast regular and Bloody Woman commissioning editor Tara Judah in the first part of this episode to discuss our thoughts on the film. And then in the second part, I will be talking with the writer-director of Koko-Di Koko-Da, Johannes Nyholm. We won't be spoiling the film in our discussion, but you might want to avoid listening to the interview with Johannes Nyholm until after you've seen the film, which is now streaming on BFI Player and other places online. Tara, thank you so much for making the time to talk about Koko-Di Koko-Da. How are you doing?
Pretty good. I loved this film actually, so I'm thrilled to talk about it. I saw it at IFFR, I guess a year and a bit, nearly 2 years ago. Yeah, really big fan of one of the short films from this filmmaker, Las Palmas, which some people will be familiar with, especially resonant for me now, as it's about a small toddler who is basically the incarnation of Brits abroad. um, Sort of trashing the place in Las Palmas. So I was really curious to see what this feature-length horror offering would be like
Mm.
from Johannes Nyholm.
So you mentioned that you loved it already, but can you expand on your overall thoughts on the film?
Yeah, so what I really like the structure of this film and other films like it. It's a cyclical structure with a kind of Groundhog Day premise that something happens over and over again. So films like Coherence, Triangle, Time Crimes for people who like those sorts of films, which I do. Those are all films I actually really love. This is the same kind of thing where something happens over and over again, and it sets up this really beautiful, it's really lovely, how there's kind of like a metaphor of a music box, that sets up how the structure of the film is going to play out. So it's a family, a couple, Tobias and Elin, and their daughter Maya. And Maya runs off to a shop window and is mesmerized by this little music box that spins round and round. And it's the old fashioned kind where you would kind of wind it round. And there's these figures on the music box that go round. And so she's lost in thought, and the parents are absolutely terrified. Oh my God, what? Don't run away from us again, that kind of thing, when they find her looking at this music box. It's about to be her birthday. So we presume they go into the shop and buy it, and it's wrapped up as a gift. Tellingly, there is a line in the film that says, well, we don't know it's a music box until tomorrow. And it's this idea about, even if you know what something is, you don't know what it will be tomorrow. So this is all really clearly signposted for what later happens, which is that there's a terrible event at the start of the film, involving shellfish, that funny shellfish, which leaves Ilin feeling really sick, and the paramedics come. And then something quite shocking happens overnight, and something happens to Maya. The couple then go into this period of grieving, and we see them 3 years later going on a camping trip. And importantly, from the moment they set off on their camping trip, they're filmed from behind. So previously, where we saw their faces, and very importantly, we saw Elin's face swollen. We saw these kind of, pictures of their faces. They were painted like rabbits. So there's this idea of like the face being quite important. Maybe it's a magical, fantastical space. And now we don't see their faces at all. We just see them from behind. And we observe them as they go on this camping trip that they don't really want to go on. Their relationships in tatters, things aren't really working. And what happens is that they they argue on the way there. They bicker about a lot of different things. And the argument's such that Elin doesn't actually, it's late at night and they haven't found the camping spot. Elin just wants to get off the road and stay at a B&B. And Tobias is having none of it. He insists that they can just drive off and camp somewhere. And his decisions and his not listening to her and their lack of communication is what sets in motion, presumably, or perhaps interpretively, this idea of the day starting, the next day that starts with the dawn. It just is this deja vu that just is something terrible is going to happen. And the figures from this music box, which is an old kind of not old but aging man in a top hat and a white hat, and a big figure, a big guy holding a dead animal, and a tall woman with these huge pigtails, and the three of them with a dog end up stalking Tobias and Elin, and with creepy and terrifying results every day. And Tobias just lives this event over and over again. It's all told from Tobias's perspective. We don't actually know that Elin has agency, even in the sense of knowing that the day is resetting.
I think I read it that Ellen definitely does not know that the day is resetting. So she's experiencing it directly anew every single time. And Tobias is very clearly learning and remembers every previous experience. We're not really told how clearly.
No, well, that's also what's interesting, is that we don't he doesn't remember. It seems as though the first time it resets, it seems as though he knows something strange, that deja vu feeling, right? Something
Yeah.
strange is happening, but he's not sure exactly what took place. He just knows danger is about to strike.
Yes.
And then we get the sense as each reset happens that he's gleaning more about and then he starts to recall the
Hmm.
figures, what the threat actually is, what's about to happen to them, why they need to try and change or break this cycle. And there's lots of ways you can read this as a metaphor for grief. You can read it as what happens in relationships when people don't communicate. There's a reading of the film as sort of direct action versus communication, and Tobias is trying to act and she's trying to communicate. There's also the kind of breakdown of masculinity. I think this fits really well into a kind of concept of recent films, and some also other Swedish films, about this idea as, I guess, not instead of toxic masculinity, but masculinity in crisis as a kind of patheticism. And it brings to mind films like Force Majeure, where we have the male character just fails to act. He fails to do the right thing. He acts, but he acts in his own self interest. And certainly there are elements of the resetting where Tobias acts in his own self interest and not in the better interest of them as a couple, as a unit, and the idea of family. And I think there's a lot of questions around what role does masculinity play in the family now. There's also a really interesting reading to be made of this film, which I can't take credit for coming up with, but my partner's Swedish, and so the couple in the film are Swedish, but
Hmm.
the man who's at the head of the kind of three creeps that enact this terror on them is Danish. Um,
Yes.
and the two figures that he's with could be viewed as migrants, and there's this threat of the migrants coming in, and obviously that also is contemporarily how a lot of migrants arriving in Sweden, they come through Denmark, obviously due to the geographical locale. So there's also a reading of this film as some sort of threat to the family unit, or threat to the Swedish potential way of life, of this idea of migrants coming in. It's interesting that those other two creeps in this scenario don't speak. They're voiceless. So we have the Swedish, we have the Danish, and we have no other language, no other linguistic communication. They just enact, and they're at the behest of the Danish man.
It's also quite interesting to know that the Mog, which is the sort of the ringleader of this trio, is played by Peter Belly, who was a pretty big Danish pop star in his time.
Yes.
So, in one of the interviews that I've done with the director Johannes Nyholm, he mentioned that he really wanted to look for kind of an old timey entertainer, someone who has that sort of,
Mm.
that presence of someone who will do the jazz hands, who will just dominate a situation, who will turn it into a circus performance almost, kind of that. I think it really comes clear, even the imagery of the way that these characters are designed. Mog is, in the white suit with a top hat. He's like the MC of this group, and you're right, he's the only one that speaks. And I'm not sure if Peter Belly was big in Sweden.
Yeah, I think he's extremely famous. Yeah, yeah, I think definitely there is that sense of like he's a very identifiable face and
Mm,
voice, like you say, and also that the song, the da, 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 Koko-Di, Koko-De,
yeah.
that actually is, I believe, quite a well known, like, children's, sort of rhyme in that
Hmm.
part of the world, so that there is that familiarity as well with this kind of like little cyclical ditty, or and it's also,
Yeah.
it's there's a sense in this film that it is kind of like, what's the physical and terrifying manifestation of an earworm, right? Like, what happens when something just gets in your head and goes over and over and round and round? It's
Yeah.
like, if you were to take a little ditty and earworm it, this is like the most horrific manifestation of that. And I
Mm,
like that idea too, that it's kind of expanding on circus themes. There's also a lot of symbolism of rabbits and cats. The man is also kind of potentially this white cat that they sort
yes.
of follow into the woods. Um, they're going down the rabbit hole. Their painted faces are painted as rabbits at the start
Hmm.
of the film. There's all this animal imagery. There's beautiful shadow puppetry sequences, really gorgeous.
Before we go into that, because I'm going to ask you about the shadow puppet scene in a minute, but
Sure.
there's something that I wanted to pick up on that you mentioned before, and that really stood out to me both of the times that I've seen this film now, is that in these types of sort of time loop horrors or sci-fi films, there's usually a lot of time spent, or at least the questioning of the explanation of why this is happening. What can we do to break it? How can we fix it? How can we take advantage of it even? And interestingly, Koko-Di Koko-Da doesn't do that. It sort of seems to embrace, or at least just go with, a sort of dream logic. And at a certain point in the film, you do kind of feel like you've now completely left reality, and this is now not following any grounded rules, and instead you're sort of taken on this very bizarre, somewhat horrifying journey. So I wanted to ask you, kind of, what do you think about this absence of rules that these films are usually subjected to, but that there are not present in Koko-Di Koko-Da?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's partially because this isn't a straight up genre film. I don't think it
Mhm.
actually, I sort of, yes, it's a horror film in some sense, but I actually would be hesitant to kind of give it that genre classification too heavy handedly. I think that it's a dramatic film. I think it operates on symbolic and metaphorical levels. I think it's quite experimental in some ways. I think that the structure of it is such that the resetting is, and the time loop in a way, is not the most interesting thing about the film. And curiously, you're right. Like, the way that it resets is not necessarily that. Often with those films, the protagonist will do something wrong, so they have to learn from their experience. But this actually, it's almost like it kind of doesn't matter what he does. Um, that
Mhm.
that we get the sense that the scenario is going to play over because it's an infinite trap. And the way that it resets is just in drawing back this huge, kind of, the camera zooms out, and we sort of see the staging, if you will, or the kind of the artifice of the setup, and it's often in a kind of cyclical sort of setup, so it looks like the music box. And that's why I think that the music box is a great premise, because it sets in motion the idea that this is just a continual circle. There's no start or end to this. It just is something that goes round and round in a loop. And so in a way, it's quite liberating, because I think as a viewer you can let go of wanting Tobias to resolve the loop.
Mhm.
You don't need to worry about whether or not he's going to find a way out, because it ultimately doesn't really matter. And even the resets don't happen exactly the same every time. So I don't think this is a spoiler to say that there is one time where we reset and Elin wakes up and Tobias isn't there. So suddenly it's from her
Mhm.
perspective for the first time. And that's really fascinating, because that almost never happens in these films, where we're like, okay, but we've got a protagonist who we know is the person trying to get out of this reset. And it's like, well, this time we've woken up and he's not there and things are slightly different. So, how does that affect the resetting? And does that do anything to perspective? Does that make us understand the characters in a different way? I mean, I think what you're ultimately looking at here is the breakdown of a relationship, two people, their shared trauma and grief, and this kind of idea that grief is inescapable, and that the way in which you live grief with someone else is potentially irreconcilable. Or maybe it is. I mean, I think that's a question the film asks rather than answers. But yeah, which I think really works to its benefit.
One of the kind of most beautiful and also enigmatic scenes of the film I found was uh the interestingly placed for me shadow puppet scene.
Mm.
And you started talking about it earlier, and I was wondering what did you think of that scene and especially its placement within the film?
Yeah, so I loved that scene. I think the shadow puppetry is absolutely beautiful. I think it's really beautifully inserted into this film. It's quite jarring in the one sense, in that it seems like we've got quite a smooth setup without it. But it is actually in that reset where Elin wakes up and things are different, and she follows the cat. I'm not going to say everything that happens narratively, but she follows the cat, who leads her to a sort of theatre or a sort of cinema, um, where she watches the shadow puppetry play out. And curiously, Elena's changed in this iteration of the loop reset. She's puffed up again. Her face is like it was earlier on in the film. She's older. She's aged. She's weary in a way that she wasn't when they set out camping. So we know that things that have changed. We don't know the specifics, and it doesn't matter. This could be much further in the future. It could be imagined. I mean, the sort of like actual kind of linear explanations for things in this film, I think you need to let go of. They're not really that important. But what happens when she watches this scene play out is it's the scene of her grief and her family's grief. And so she watches rabbits as if they are her and Tobias and her daughter Maya. And she watches a bird, which could be a number of people or things. It could be the creeps. It could be a metaphor for God. It could be the phoenix that rises from the ashes. There's all of that is in there. There's layers to this. I think that she watches this play out, this scene in front of her, and in many ways, it's the processing of grief and trauma. It's the kind of coming to terms with replaying something in your mind. It's the idea of loop replaying as a way of processing grief, memory, abstraction. I mean, I think it's important that memory doesn't play out as a linear kind of live action narrative for her, but it plays out as an abstract but painful but beautiful puppetry performance. And also, it's the idea that cinema, storytelling, shadow, and light um, i- holds so much for us culturally. We think about what is the allegory of Plato's cave? What is the shared thing about storytelling and cinema going? Is that it harks back to campfires. It harks back to sitting around in a circle, sharing and telling stories over flickering images of light. That's the allegory of the cave. That's the premise of projection and cinema. That's the projection that of early cinema, which is what shadow puppetry like this is. It reminds us of Lottie Reiniger. All of these kinds of things is that it has something to do with the art form, and I think without having I'd be really curious to hear. I look forward to hearing the interview you did with Johannes Nyholm. That without kind of hearing his motivation, but sort of knowing that he's made these short films and there is that element of live action and puppetry, or kind of using
Mhm.
those things together in his craft previously. That I think there is an element of reflection on the art form here, and so I think that the craft of the film is also saying something about the craft of cinema.
I was going to ask you something else, but that's such a wonderful note to end on. So thank you so much, Tara.
Great, thank you. I mean, I love this film, so
Oh, good. I'm glad we got to. I'm glad we get to talk about films that you love.
Me too.
Is there anything that you wanted to mention about the film that you feel like you may not have covered?
No, I think the only thing I would say is that there's a really lovely piece written about this film that will be up on Bloody
Mm-hmm.
Women by Alice Taylor Matthews, and it expands on the idea of communication, gendered communication, especially as it plays out in the film, that I would recommend people read.
Fantastic. Tara, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And now we're going to move into my interview with the writer-director of Koko-Di, Koko-Da, Johannes Nyholm.
Vad gör du? Vad gör... Du kan ju inte bara köra in hur som helst, var som helst.
Kan jag väl? Jag har allemansrätt här.
Johannes, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for making the time.
Thank you very much.
I love the film. I've seen it twice now on the big screen and at a festival last year and again in advance of this interview. And congratulations for not making me want to fall asleep or have a dream ever again.
Well, I'm sorry about that.
I wanted to ask you because Koko-Di Koko-Da has been described in many ways. I've read it being described as a surrealist horror film, as a dark fairy tale. I wanted to ask you kind of what is your own relationship with horror cinema?
I always liked films when you feel something in your stomach or feel something, kind of a physical sensation of the film, that it affects you in that way. And horror films, good horror films does that. Or absurd comedy films can do that as well. But I think a lot of my favorite movies from when I was a kid were horror films for just that reason, because it could really affect you in ways that weren't kind of philosophical but really physical.
And what were some of those favorites, if you wouldn't mind sharing them?
I think I was 8 when I saw Psycho, for example, and it made such a big impact on me. We acted out, me and some friends, we acted out the best scenes of the film over and over and over again, just to kind of try to understand it and try to get it out of our minds. It was so powerful.
When developing or in the process of making Koko-Di, did you draw from any influences either within film or horror specifically?
I'm most inspired by my own experiences. I think like dreams that I had in certain periods of my life, and people I met more than actual films. People have said that this reminds me of this or that film and so, but for me, that's not the origin. It's something that I've experienced for real.
So what is the origin of the film?
For me, it's dreams, dreams and real things that I've experienced, things that I've gone through in my life.
And you mentioned dreams and kind of dream logic, and it's certainly something that comes across in a film. How did you go about translating your own dreams or images or experiences into images on screen, into a film that sort of follows a dream logic as opposed to a real life grounded logic?
I think a lot of dreams has this structure, this kind of repeating structure that you feel that you travel, you travel and walk and run or whatever you do, but you end up in the same place, like you're trying to escape, trying to go somewhere, but you're not getting anywhere. It's like every place is the same, or you go to a new place but there are similarities from the other ones, so you kind of get the feeling that that all places is one place and all people are one person or something like that. Those kind of sensations that I'm interested in, that everything kind of everything fits together in a way. Universe is very complex, but it's in one way it's all the same. Those kind of notions, you can get those kind of notions when you dream, or at least I do.
You mentioned briefly there's a structure of the loop, of the time loop. Can you talk a little bit about the choice or the way that the horror in those time loops and those scenes or chapters evolved throughout the making of the film? Did you have very specific ideas of what you wanted from each loop, from each chapter, or did it evolve as you were making the film?
Both ways, actually. I mean, I had at the beginning, I had kind of one part of the film that was quite clear in the loops, but then after we shot them, I added some more. I actually wrote them down after waking up from a dream. I kind of saw everything that happened in the film in front of my eyes. As it's actually happened. I knew, I mean, it was like an awake dream, whatever that's called, lucid dream or whatever. I could see all these characters and everything just acting out in front of me, and I just wrote it down. Like those repetitions going over and over again with small differences. And then, I mean, more or less, that is what happens in the film. But then I mean, it evolved a little bit also from that.
And can you talk a little bit about your choice of ending each one of these loops or chapters with an aerial shot and kind of a moment of stillness?
Yeah, I think we call those shots the God's view. It's like a shot from above, like someone sees you from another what do you say, from another reality or from another perspective. It's like you are so small, and it's like you are trapped in your destiny. You can't do anything about it. It's that kind of cold view on things, like you're just a little ant trying to run around there, but it doesn't affect anything. You're trapped in that situation. It's like almost the surrounding woods there is like you can really see that you are trapped in this opening in the woods. It's like a little bit like an old Greek amphitheater or a gladiator play or whatever, that you're trapped in this opening and you're not getting anywhere, and someone is just looking at you from above. It's like you're not getting anywhere, and you're part of this play, whether you want it or not.
And it's interesting you mentioned the woods. Could you talk a little bit about choosing to set the majority of the film in this forest?
Yeah, I want to what do you say? See the primal parts of the humankind, or the primal feelings. I want to dwell a little bit into that, and I mean, there's some kind of gradual development in the film where you're using less and less language, being less and less social, going further and further away from each other, and being, I guess, more and more primal during the way. The primal instincts take over during time, and I want to have this kind of timeless feeling that you are trapped on planet Earth, and it's not something that has to do with our specific time here and now, with our modern things that we're surrounded with. It's I want to have this primal feeling that this could happen anytime, anywhere, 1,000 years ago, and it happens now, or whatever. We humans, we are we are the same. We're animals, and we're many ways trying to hide from that fact.
And that brings me on to my next question, actually, which was about the animals in the film, the dog and also the cat. And I wanted to ask you kind of about why you wanted to. They feel like characters in themselves, or sort of guides in these in this dreamscape scenario or this nightmare scenario. So, what role did you want the animals to play?
I think it's much more powerful to have a cat as a guide than a person with an idea, or with I mean, if it was a person, you could feel that this person has an agenda. The cat doesn't have an agenda at all. It's like it's more like faith or something that has to be done, or something else. It's a mystery related to it that you really can't really explain. It's just like, this is the way it has to be, and you can't argue with it. And you can't even direct a cat to be a guide either. So it's to have a cat, an undirectable cat doing pretty specific things, makes it much more powerful and mysterious.
Was it always a cat?
Yeah, it was.
I wanted to pick up on something that you mentioned before, kind of about the lead characters, Tobias and Ellen, sort of descending into a more and more primal state. Could you talk a little bit about your choice of making Tobias aware of what was happening and remembering each previous death, each previous iteration of violence, and Ellen unable to remember it?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted the gap between them to widen during the film, so the friction kind of got worse and worse and worse until it explodes in a way. And I mean, as he wants to tell or warn Ellen about the threat, he gets more and more sure that this is what's going to happen. We are being chased by these criminals. They want to kill us, and for every iteration, he gets more and more sure that this is actually what will happen. And she gets more and more sure that he's going crazy, because it's so surreal. It's so such as the story is so strange. So I mean, her only interpretation is that he's going crazy. So this gap gradually evolves during the film. This gap, which has to do with, I mean, it's a fact in all relationships that you don't always connect, you don't understand each other, or you're at different places. You don't reach out to each other, you don't understand each other, misinterpretation, and so. And this is what's gradually building.
The film deals a lot with that gap in between their relationship, but also with loss, with grief, or trauma, and how they're dealing with it. You can project a lot of things onto the film. But do you think that dark fantasy or horror as a film genre has particularly apt to deal or to process visually and creatively difficult human subjects like that?
I think you can use any genre to tell any stories in a way, but I mean, this kind of grief, losing someone that you really love, it's kind of the most horrifying thing that you can think of. So I guess it's, in one way, it's natural to go into those themes with horror films, I guess, but it doesn't need to be that. In my next film, it will be kind of a very burlesque slapstick movie, but it will also be about loss in a similar way.
And it's interesting you mentioned slapstick, because I wanted to talk a little bit about the humor of the film, which is a quite slapstick and kind of very carnivalesque. And was there something kind of particularly interesting for you about bringing in that kind of old school carnival entertainment approach into this very dark setting?
I mean, in one way, it's. I mean, I grew up with that kind of humor with Charlie Chaplin and Laurel and Hardy. Is that what they call it in English?
Laurel and Hardy, yeah.
Yeah. I love kind of physical humor.
Mm-hmm.
In the same way as I like when films or any kind of entertainment really gets to you physically, and slapstick does that. It's so primal. It's such a raw art form, which I really enjoy. You don't need to understand it, or you don't need to understand the idea behind it, but you can still appreciate a cake in your face or whatever. You don't know why it's funny, but it's just funny. It's physical.
It's interesting you mentioned kind of physicality, because one thing that I found very interesting just visually is the physicality of this of Mog and his fellows or his
Yeah.
friends. So kind of
Yeah.
how did you build them visually? Did you have specific images of when you were thinking about the film, developing it, of how they were supposed to look and move?
I mean, I want them to be irrational. You should never understand them. I think it's important. It's important that you don't understand them. You don't understand why they do what they do. You don't understand why they look like they look, and they're kind of an irrational trio that doesn't belong together at all. They are very separate from each other, and so I think the irrational element was really important to make them both very physical and non-physical at the same time. There should be kind of a paradox. I think that's the idea. But it was as I saw them. I saw them like this in my dreams. This is what more or less what they looked like, and more or less how they behaved. And I really enjoy that mysterious tone with them, that you can't really understand who the hell are they, where do they come from. What motives do they have? They don't have any motive. It's just they just do it.
To kind of start wrapping up a conversation a little bit, I wanted to ask you: there's plenty of violence, there's plenty kind of scary imagery and kind of almost inverted imagery with things that are, not necessarily scary in themselves, but they're made scary by the combination of, the mood, the atmosphere, the performances, the looping. And I was wondering if there's any particular scene or images that you found either yourself or through people's reactions to the film that particularly touched a nerve.
I mean, it's hard to say. Usually what people talk about is things that stand out from the rest. If they, for example, in this case, what stands out most is the shadow play. Because I mean, you get used to one type of storytelling, and then it twists into something completely different in the middle. And that's kind of a film within the film. That's people usually comment that a lot, because it's so different in every aspect from the rest. It has this very picturesque tone and this very beautiful music, as opposed to the much rawer mood of the rest of the film. It's very raw, but then you have this very delicate, fragile shadow play in the middle, which is very, I mean, compassionate and very. It's supposed to be some kind of extreme beauty, like something that you can like a pillow that you can cuddle when you're afraid, or something that can comfort you in your worst nightmares. Then you have this shadow play that can comfort you and help you. And I think people appreciate that contrast.
I was going to ask you about the shadow play, but you've just answered my question before I even asked it in the best possible way. But thank you so much. And I just as a final really question for anyone who may have seen the film and still has questions or feelings about it, kind of what would you hope that people take away from it?
I think it's important to give some kind of hope. It's a very dark story, but to me, it's important that you come out of this with high hopes, that you could see something beautiful, even in the most bizarre and dark experiences in life. There could come something really, really beautiful out of it when you least expect it. So maybe that's it.
That's wonderful. Johannes, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you.